Hi, I wanted to spend a few minutes trying to address what I think is a conundrum that a number of us face when we're talking about Israel and the role of Israel at the United Nations and so on. And that's the allegation that the UN is somehow biased against Israel because of the number of critical votes that it faces. And I prepared a very short PowerPoint presentation to try to get at what I think is the motivations behind this situation, so that we can all be able to discuss it with people when they were confronted with that argument. So this little PowerPoint, it's 15 minutes long. Why does the UN General Assembly always single out Israel for criticism? The UN meets, 193 countries of the UN meet in New York every fall. The sessions go for a month and a half or so. Often starts off with high-profile presentations from people like Mr. Biden or President Abbas or Lula. And then later on, they move to resolutions. And I want to address the question of whether or not it's true that the UN criticizes Israel more than any other state. And if it's so, if that is so, why is this the case? First of all, just on the numbers, on the facts, it's absolutely true that the UN criticized Israel not only more than other countries, but more than every other country put together. I have these figures here from the Jewish Virtual Library. They go from 2012 to 2020. I don't think that the 2021 or 2022 figures would be much different. But if you look at 2012, there are 22 resolutions critical of Israel and only 4 relating to the rest of the world. Same thing is true in 2015, where there's 20 resolutions on Israel and only 3 on the rest of the world, 2020, 17, and 6. So you can see there is a general pattern here, and it's absolutely true that Israel is being criticized not only more than any other state, but all other states together. So what is the cause of this? Well, those people who defend Israel are quick to argue that there is a bias at the UN against Israel. Perhaps it's a bias against Israel, perhaps it's an animosity against Jews, perhaps anti-Semitism. I wouldn't discount totally the fact that we know that anti-Semitism does exist in the world, and that may be a factor, but I don't think it's a sufficient factor to explain it. Many of the countries who vote don't really have any particular relations with Israel, not very big relations. They don't have very many Jews, so why would they be voting that way? Perhaps Arab and Muslim countries, you might argue that there is some motivation there, but the numbers voting against Israel far exceed the numbers of Arab or Muslim states. On the other side, people might say that it's because Israel's human rights records are so terrible. But is it really credible to say that Israel's human rights records are worse, 5 times worse than any other country in the world? Worse, for example, than human rights violations of the Rohingya, of Myanmar, of Sri Lanka, of the state of Egypt. There's a lot of talk of criticism of human rights in Iran, but for some reason, there are 5 times as many resolutions, not only against Israel, but against everybody together. So it seems hard to make a case that this is really a reflection purely of Israel's human rights record, though that record certainly deserves to be criticized. I think that this leads me to look for another and deeper explanation. And I think part of it lies in the fact that Israel has a unique status in the UN system. Israel is the only member state that was created by the UN. It came about as a result of a UN resolution passed in 1947. That resolution, called UN General Assembly 181, took 55% of Palestine and gave it to European Jewish refugees in order to allow them to create a state of their own. And a year later, under some pressure from the United States, the UN allowed Israel to join it, but on certain conditions. Now, we have to remember the context. European anti-Semitism that had gone back for centuries culminated in the Holocaust. First, a desire to ethnically cleanse Germany by expelling Jews, and then the Nazis moved to a final solution, which ended with the murder of 6 million Jews and the almost complete wiping out of European Jewry. Western countries, including Europe, Canada, and the United States, did not have a stellar record, and they were looking for a solution to the Jewish problem. Canada and other countries had suffered shame and guilt over the horror of the Holocaust, and particularly over the little we had done to protect Jews during the Nazi period. Everybody will remember this ship, this unlucky ship, the St. Louis, that brought European immigrants, refugees, to, first of all, to Cuba, and then to the United States, and then to Canada, and all three places, including Canada, refused to accept these refugees. They were forced to return to Hamburg, where many of them died in concentration camps. So while Canada felt shameful over what we had done during the Holocaust, we didn't want them here. We didn't want Jews here. In fact, Canada was still rife with anti-Semitism. Even in the 40s, Jews in Canada were restricted from certain private clubs. There were quotas on Jews on many campuses in the university. The idea was you shouldn't allow too many Jews to take over our campuses. Jewish doctors had trouble getting residency, and so on. So Canada, while we felt guilty over the Holocaust, we didn't want the Jews here. And for us and for other countries, it was a solution seemed to be, we'll give the European Jews part of Palestine, encourage them to go there. They can have a country of their own. And so in November 1947, the UN General Assembly voted Resolution 181, which divided British Mandate Palestine into three parts: a Jewish state, which is the part you see in blue here on the map, an Arab state or Palestinian state, which is the beige part on the map, and Jerusalem, which itself would be under international auspices, not part of the Arab state, not part of the Jewish state, recognizing their importance to three Abrahamic religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Now, that vote took place on the 29th of November, and 33 countries voted for it, 13 voted against, and 10 abstained. A couple of things are important to note about that vote. First of all, I should remind you that that resolution was put forward by a special committee that Canada was a part of. So Canada actually proposed the partition of Palestine and proposed giving more than 55% of Palestine to European immigrant Jews. When you look at the vote, first of all, the total of the vote only amounts to 56. And that's reflective of the fact that at that time, and the UN, which was freshly created, only created in 1945, still only had 56 members. And it was mostly dominated by the European countries, though there were also a significant number of Caribbean and South American countries, which were brought in under American auspices. You can see right away from looking at the border that it's a bizarre border and the problems are brewing. But the biggest problem was that Palestine was not empty. There were already 1.5 million Palestinians living in Mandate Palestine, and many of them were living in the blue areas, living in the areas assigned to Israel, living in Beersheba, living in Haifa, living in here in the north. Now, this caused was the source of the Nakba, because to have a Jewish state, Jews had to be in the majority. But those European Jews at the time were only 1/3 of the population of Palestine. So how can they have a Jewish state if Jews are only 1/3 of the population? Well, there are really only two answers to that question. One is to bring in more European Jews, and the other was to start expelling the Palestinians. And the new Zionist forces and then the State of Israel undertook to do both of those very aggressively. And starting the day after the UN vote, armed Zionist militias started expelling the Palestinians. And in 16 months, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled, leaving behind all their possessions. Now, not all the Zionist groups agreed with the UN proposal. Some wanted much more, including Menachem Begin, who subsequently became Prime Minister of Israel. But David Ben-Gurion, as the head of the Jewish Agency, welcomed the UN plan as a first step. And if you look on the map on the left-hand side, the white area over here is 55% of historic Palestine, and that's what the UN proposed. However, Israel expanded its borders by the time 16 months later had come, and they had taken over 78%. So while accepting the UN resolutions, the Zionist forces immediately started to convene them in at least 4 different ways. They took over much more land than UN authorized. They took over West Jerusalem. They took over Jaffa and expelled the Palestinians from there, and they expelled 750,000 Palestinians. You see the arrows here of the Palestinian refugees who are trying to escape and would not allow them to return. Now, the UN responded to this in December 1948 by passing a resolution 194 on the right of return. This resolution was first proposed to it by the UN named mediator, Count Bernadotte of Sweden, and it passed by basically the same numbers, 35 for, 15 against, as 18 abstained, as it voted for the creation of Israel in the first place. And that resolution said that refugees, talking now about Palestinian refugees, wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. What was Israel's response to this resolution? Well, in the first place, some Zionist extremists assassinated Count Bernadotte, and Israel actually ignored the rest of the resolution and did not allow any Palestinian who tried to return would be shot at the border as an infiltrator. Shortly thereafter, Israel was admitted to the UN under some pressure from the United States, and the UN General Assembly noted the declaration by the State of Israel that it unreservedly accepts the obligations of the Charter, and it reminded Israel of the resolution of 29th November 1947, which was the resolution creating the new Jewish state and its borders, and reminded Israel of the resolution on 11th December 1948, which was the resolution on the right of return. And on that basis, it decided to admit Israel to membership in the United Nations. Now, this is important because it means that Israel was admitted to the UN apparently agreeing to accept the 1947 borders and on accepting the right of return. But since then, Israel has violated UN resolutions and ignored its obligations. It has now annexed all of Jerusalem. In 1948, it took over, 1947, it took over the western part of Jerusalem, and in 1967, it took over the rest of it, notwithstanding the UN resolution, which said that Jerusalem should be neutral and not part of either the Arab nor the Jewish state. Israel refused to accept the borders proposed by the UN in 1947. In fact, Israel has never declared its borders, but keeps on expanding them. Israel has refused to accept the principle of the right of return that was voted by the UN General Assembly, and it physically and militarily prevents Palestinians from exercising that right. So you see here in the bottom a picture of tens of thousands of Palestinians trying to exercise their UN-approved right of return. There they are at the fence. The Gaza is on the far side, Israel's on this side. They're trying to return, and they are being physically repelled by Israeli military using tear gas, smoke bombs, and snipers. The Israelis actually killed 205 Palestinians over a 6-month period, and 21,000 Palestinians were injured, of which 11,000 actually required hospitalization. Israel has been found to be in violation of many other UN resolutions on the path of the wall, which obviously often was not between Israel and the West Bank, but went far into the West Bank, on the illegality of the occupation, on the contravention of Geneva Convention through house demolitions, excessive use of violence in Gaza, and so on and so forth. So every year there are resolutions at the United Nations General Assembly on Israel-Palestine. It's usually the same 16 resolutions, more or less. I've here picked 10 of them as examples because I couldn't fit 16 on more than one page, and the numbering is mine. There's no particular ordering to the numbering other than to identify it. But for example, one resolution is on natural resources, which says the Palestinian people living in the occupied Palestinian territory, OPT, have the right to control their own natural resources, which Israel denies and uses the natural resources when and where it wants to. Another resolution is on the self-determination, on the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. A third resolution is on Jerusalem, recalling the fact that the UN resolution said that Jerusalem should not be under Israeli control nor under Palestinian control, but should be under international auspices. So those resolutions come on over and over again. Let's just see what happens. Here's an example. So here is an example from last year, so December last year, a resolution calling on the International Joint Commission, the UN General Assembly, asking the International Joint Commission, International Court of Justice, sorry, to make an advisory opinion on the legality of the Israeli occupation. Well, Western countries, including Canada, generally vote to defend Israel. So you can see Canada here says, no, we don't want that. United States says, no, we don't want that. Israel says we don't want that. Germany votes against it. In general, it's the Western countries that vote to defend Israel. The cities from the global South, on the other hand, either criticize Israel by voting yes. So you see all the, in this case, you have 87 in favor, 26 against. So you have in the yes category, you have countries from Bahamas to Belize to Chile, China, Nigeria, Slovenia, Sudan, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, some of this entails some grandstanding. So you can see, for example, Saudi Arabia here votes to refer Israel to the International Court of Justice. All the while, Saudi Arabia is in the course of negotiating legalization, normalization with Israel. So some countries use this as a way to strut their anti-colonial feathers while they don't actually do anything. So why then do I think that the UN General Assembly singles out Israel for criticism over and over? Well, is it a reflection of a bias against Israel or anti-Semitism? I think there's some element of that. I don't think it should be discarded. Is it because of Israel's egregious violation of human rights? Well, there again, there are lots of reasons to condemn Israel's violation of human rights. As we know, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch have recently come out with reports accusing Israel of exercising an apartheid system over the Palestinians, not only in the West Bank, but inside Israel itself. But I think this is explained by four more important factors. First of all, the UN was responsible for creating Israel and admitting it to the UN under certain conditions. Secondly, Israel is a constant and repeated violator of many UN resolutions. And thirdly, the annual votes mostly repeat the same resolutions year after year. So while it looks like there are dozens and dozens and dozens of resolutions against Israel, many times it's the same resolution. The kind of metaphorical comparison I would make is a parent saying to your child, clean up your room. And then the next day you say, clean up your room. And the third day they clean up your room. He never does it. And then the fourth time when you say, clean up your room, you say, why are you criticizing me all the time? Well, the reason is that the room hasn't been cleaned up. And lastly, and I think this is an important factor, the UN is now not the same UN it was in 1947 when there were 53 members. The UN is now dominated by the global South, which increasingly sees Israel as a prime example of Western colonialism. So those, I think, are the main reasons why I think the UN does vote repeatedly against Israel. And I think if you talk to someone who thinks or worries that the main motivation for this is anti-Semitism, I think you have good arguments to say to them, no, that's not really the case. There are other very good reasons why the UN will criticize Israel repeatedly. Now, one question remains is, there will be again votes this year. I expect that the voting pattern will be very similar. We might wonder as Canadians how Canada will vote. Well, based on past experiences, out of those 16 resolutions, Canada may vote or abstain on one or two, but in general, Canada will vote with the other former colonial powers, vote with Israel, vote with the United States against the wishes of the vast majority of UN members. And at a time when Canada hopes to be named as a member of the UN chair of the Human Rights Commission, this makes Canada's candidacy somewhat more problematic. Anyway, if you agree with my argument, please feel free to share this video with other people. If you disagree with it, please feel free to send me a note explaining why. You can write to me at ofip.chair@gmail.com, and I'd be pleased if you write comments. I'd be glad to publish them in the comments section of my blog. Thanks very much.